Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for gathering round. If you're just walking past and you are interested in an interesting presentation, then I encourage you to step forward and sit down. So I'm going to try and get you to remember one thing from this presentation, if only that, and that is this concept of risk auditing. So why I believe the future of disaster risk reduction is risk auditing. I want you at the end of this presentation to be able to articulate clearly why this is the case. I'm going to try and convince you of this fact in the next 15 minutes. So the Sendai framework, we're here to explore progress 2 years down the road on the 2015 Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. The first goal of the framework says to substantially reduce global mortality 2030, aiming to lower the average per 100,000 global mortality rate in the decade 2020-2030 compared to the period 2005 to 2015. So the first question is the baseline of 2005 to 2015, is that a fair indication of what is the true average level of mortality from disasters on planet Earth? So, because the question is, I mean, is there some potential we can actually achieve this goal by chance alone, simply because that decade was a particularly bad decade for disasters? So, by chance alone, we may actually do really well. Is it possible that the 2005-2015 period, is it actually a suitable sample for testing the current mean rate of global disaster casualties? I mean, is it a reasonable baseline to use at all? And is there a better way to measure casualty reduction than simply comparing 2 decades of data, one of which may fortuitously be particularly high or particularly low? And I mean, it turns out this is a very poor goal to have, in fact, because and to give you an example of why this is, in the country of Haiti, fewer than 10 people died from an earthquake caused since the year 1900. So for more than a century, between 1900 and 2010, fewer than 10 people died in an earthquake in Haiti. And then on one afternoon in 2010, in late January, more than 200,000 people died. So picking simply a decade of data to tell us the average, it doesn't work. You can't simply pick a decade of data and believe you can compare it with another decade and think it tells you anything other than that you're dealing with an extremely volatile phenomenon, which is actually global casualties is highly volatile. We actually need a better way of reflecting the latency of mass casualties. So if we took a decade in the period, say 1960s in Haiti, nobody died in an earthquake. So how would we know anything about the potential for a large catastrophe to happen? We wouldn't. It's simply not. There's simply no information in such a decade. We have to do a better way of finding out what this latency of potential deaths in disasters is. It doesn't work, this comparison of decades. So we actually did a study last year. We actually had an intern and we did an investigation of the population of large-scale disasters, and looking all the way back to 1970 and actually making it as a proportion of the population of the Earth at the time. So it's completely reasonable. We're adjusting it for changes in population. And what you see is it's highly volatile. The early part of the record was very high in big disasters. The middle part had very few big disasters. The last 10 years was actually quite a high period, a high decade of activity of fatalities in earthquakes. We published this paper on it, so it's actually in a peer-reviewed journal to actually have a look at this problem. And if you take the decadal average of different decades, you can see it jumps around, and it jumps around principally because this phenomenon is too highly volatile, even at a global level. You can't simply take 10 years of data and think it tells you the true average. It doesn't. It's simply a highly volatile process because it's dominated by the really big the really high mortality loss disasters. So if we try and compare 2 decades of data, as the Sendai framework tells us we're going to have to do, what we'll get is what's called a spurious result. And spurious, if it's not part of your everyday vocabulary, it means apparently but not actually valid. So some countries will think they're doing fantastically well because they'll have fewer casualties in the period 2020 to 2030, and some will have more and they'll think they're doing really badly, but in fact neither of those countries will actually know what the true situation is, because you can't actually tell how you're doing from a decade of data. The data is simply too volatile. So what can we do about it? Well, what we could do about it is we can actually do, instead of simply using a decade, we can do a process which I'm calling disaster risk auditing. So I'm going to try and explain to you what it is, who does it, and how it can be used to measure progress in disaster risk reduction, true progress in disaster risk reduction. So this is based on the same principle as auditing, which goes on for the financial affairs of cities and governments. Auditing is done, it's independently assessed by commercial auditing companies. They consider all the factors that could affect the sovereign risk of that country or that city, and they express risk in a probability range of default. So you've probably heard something being AA rated or a B- or something. That is simply a range of probability that country is going to default. It's actually based on the principle of auditing that country for its future financial performance. So we need to do something similar of auditing that country for its future disaster risk performance is what we need to do. Now, the way the auditing goes for the financial affairs, it looks at all the factors out there. It's sort of time independent. It's simply saying what is the probability that country is going to go bankrupt in the next 10 years. And that probability may be, say, 1 in 1,000. It may be very low, but there's some probability it can happen. Now, if we're going to do risk auditing, there are a number of metrics we might want to do it for. Not simply, we might want to do it for lives. We might want to audit, well, what is the potential for loss of life? What does that distribution look like? What is the potential for loss of money? You clearly might be interested in that if you're the finance minister of that country. You might be interested in what is the potential for a food crisis in that country, or the loss of livelihoods of a lot of poor people. That might also be a metric. So there's a range of metrics you might well be interested in if you're going to underdo this audit. And it's going to be based on risk modeling. So exactly the same principle that is used by the insurance industry for trying to understand catastrophe risk. The insurance industry around 25 to 30 years ago almost went out of business because they had a succession of large catastrophes. They were losing huge amounts of money. They had no idea how to price the risk of catastrophe. And so catastrophe modeling came along, where you make a synthetic data set of potential disasters. You make like a 10,000 year set of potential earthquakes or hurricanes, and you throw those events at your portfolio to get a series of answers as to how much you can expect to lose, how much financially, and then from that you can find the average annualized loss. The average annualized loss actually normalized across a 10,000 year period of simulation, for example, tells you what is the average amount you need to set aside each year to fund all your future disasters. We need exactly the same process for measuring how we're doing on disasters, looking at loss of life, looking at loss of money in particular, and actually using these synthetic data sets, which are now very well established. This is an industry which is worth about $500 million a year of catastrophe risk modeling employed by the insurance industry for working out how to price and measure catastrophe risk. We need to apply exactly the same process for actually measuring how we're doing around disasters. It's the only way to evaluate the contribution from tail disaster losses, the tail losses which you almost certainly won't get in a 10-year period. We can employ, now clearly the challenge will come when we start doing this. We may not have models for everywhere, we may not have all the data everywhere. We can use simpler procedures to start with before full modeling capability is available, but a lot of modeling capability already exists in order to actually undertake this procedure. This is the framework for earthquake casualty modeling. It's already widely used for looking at what is the population at risk at a particular time of day that might suffer loss of life or injury in an earthquake somewhere. We already know how to do this. It's used for actually pricing earthquake life insurance, for example. So we have the ability to do this. We can take out expected losses. We develop what's called an exceedance probability curve of potential losses. We can take out the losses at key return periods like 1 in 100 or 1 in 500, which might be the metrics we want to use to see if we're making progress. We can, if we're going to, now clearly as we go through time, we're going to improve the risk model, and therefore we might want to go back and look at an estimate of risk at the start of a 5-year period, because I'm proposing we should do this once every 5 years in order to get a perspective on whether we're making progress or not. Are we reducing casualties? Are casualties increasing over time? This process can help tell us the reality of actually how we're really doing. Excuse me. So this is what an exceedance probability curve looks like for earthquake casualties in America. We find, for example, that we have about a 1 in 100 year loss of around 2,000 people being killed in a single earthquake. The estimate for what would happen if the Cascadia earthquake happened in the US is about 13,000 casualties. That event probably has somewhere between a 500 and 1,000 year return period. I first wrote a paper on the fact that we should be doing this in 2012, how we should be using these methodologies to design and monitor disaster resilience goals and indicators in a post-MDG framework. So we tried putting this forward before the Sendai process actually came out. It wasn't picked up, I think, simply because it was not possible to convince all the countries that had to sign Sendai that this was the appropriate way forward. But this is really the only way you can actually get a perspective on whether you're making progress around your disasters. Tokyo City has already embraced something like this. In 2015, in March, they established a process to measure how many people would be killed in a repeat of an 1855 earthquake, a magnitude 7 earthquake, directly under the city. They set themselves a target to reduce their disaster casualties by 50% in 5 years, and they're going to measure their performance using models. So no, they don't need any disaster to tell them whether they're making progress or not. They're going to use modeling to tell them how they're doing. And they got 3 things they're going to work on: earthquake-resistant buildings, circuit breakers to be made universal, and improved fire suppression of industrial facilities. So they've worked out how to do it, they've worked out how to measure it, and they're going to see if they've made sufficient progress through time. Now, every city in the front line of disasters could do exactly the same thing as what Tokyo is doing, and it's, as I say, it's the only way you're going to get on top of this. Now, we know that political leaders, the reason why this should be independent, this shouldn't be done, I don't think, by countries themselves. It should be done independently, because political leaders like to distribute money after the disaster, not invest in disaster risk reduction. We find situations of how politicians win votes from disasters. There's very good studies now showing that if you're a politician, the best thing to do is give no money for disaster risk reduction, simply to turn up after the disaster and hand out lots of money. You'll get re-elected. It's kind of this, it's really established this is the case. You can't trust politicians to do the right thing. You actually need them to be tested and have to live with the fact that the audit is going to happen whether they like it or not, and they've got to demonstrate whether they're making progress or not. We need this to be globally consistent, we need it to be standards-based, we need it to be unbiased. We need an international society of disaster risk auditors to vet that the procedures being used are appropriate. They could be done internal to a country. A country could get this done, but make sure it's blessed and vetted by the Standards Association. And this would hold mayors and national leaders to account, because every 5 years it would come round again what the audit says about whether they're making progress. If the mayor is not making a progress, he won't get re-elected. Excellent, we'll get a mayor in who is able to focus on driving down this number in order to show that we are making progress. So the results of the audit would come out, you get it on a headline on the newspaper: the latest risk audit raises the California 100-year earthquake casualties. The mayor would lose his job, or his or her job, I should say. And this will be independent. Who will fund it? Rich countries will be expected to fund their own disaster risk auditing, but done according to the standards procedure. Lower income countries, audits will be funded by donor agencies, and you'll focus on the V20 countries. You'll focus on the countries which have got the highest risk in order to see, are they making progress or not? Simply waiting for a 10-year period is not going to tell you. So that is my final slide. I hope you remember one thing: independent disaster risk auditing of countries and cities. It's the only way to measure if you're making real progress around disasters. Independent auditing of disaster risk by countries and cities. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Thank you.